future of civilization. We don't tend to think about the possibility that our civilization may collapse at some point. However, if we look back in time, we realize very soon that history is essentially a cemetery of empires and civilizations. So why would our civilization be any different? What makes us special?
And welcome to another installment of Behind Greatness by Inspire. Luciano here speaking. So today we're welcoming Marco Vigato. Marco joins us from his home in Mexico City. He has spent the last 15 years researching the question of the origins of civilization around the world. No small task. He is the author of The Empires of Atlantis, published by Inner Traditions, and a frequent contributor to various print and online journals. He holds degrees from Milan's Bocconi University and has an MBA from Harvard. He's a native of Italy. He lives and works in Mexico City. He is the founder and president of the ARX project, ARX, Association of Archaeological Research and Exploration, through which he has directly conducted and sponsored numerous research projects and expeditions in different parts of Mexico and Mesoamerica. For his work, he has been featured as an expert on ancient Mesoamerica in numerous TV documentaries and interviews, to say the least, numerous. Welcome to the show, Marco.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Luciano. It's a pleasure to be here with you and your audience.
Very cool. Thank you. Thank you. So for the listener, sometimes we give like small origin stories of how we meet and how we connect with our guests. With you, like, you were a point of curiosity. It was literally about me. It was a timing thing. I was just walked by the family room one evening, and my younger boy was watching a Netflix series, and there was this guy who's speaking English very, very well, with what I sensed was an Italian accent. And they were at an ancient site in Mexico. I said, all this mix of cultures and language. What is this about? So I sat down and I listened to you, I don't know, probably about 4 or 5 minutes. And then I turned to my son, who doesn't like to get interrupted when he's listening to things. And so he grunted answers to me. So of course I found out your name. I looked you up. I said, okay, let's reach out to him. This is very cool. And so we looked at it a little bit more. And there you go. There we have it. And we reached out, we chatted a couple of times, and here we are. So enough of that. You're a guy who went to Harvard Business School and business school in northern Italy in Milan. You are living in Mexico City. What the hell are you doing? Studying ancient sites. How does that all match, or does it match?
That's a passion I've always had since a very young age for history, for the study of the past. Growing up in Italy, I would go on holiday, spend a lot of time visiting archaeological sites. My father studied archaeology, and so that's how I inherited this passion. And of course, more as an adult in recent years, it's always been something that I've tried to grow and cultivate on the side. Even though I then decided to move into business, archaeology has always remained a very big passion of mine. So with time, I got a lot more interested, as you say, in this question of the origins of civilization. And about 4 years ago, in 2021, I started a research association here in Mexico called the ARX project to actually walk the talk and really put some real-time, real investment into research, into trying to find out more about the true origins of civilization, and doing it particularly in a place like Mexico, where there are so many ancient artifacts, so many ancient cultures of which we know very little about.
Yeah. Okay. So you've said so many different artifacts, so many different cultures. Growing up in North America, what we learn here is very cursory at best about ancient civilizations on our continent. We know probably more about what happens in North, or what's what's been excavated in North Africa more than anything, the Middle East and in Asia, than we do about Mexico and Central America. So we learn a little bit about the Aztecs and a little bit about the Mayans. We confuse them both mostly. This is like a broad stroke represent. Like I'm representing all of North Americans here, obviously. Let's go right into then with a quick question, because we've learned a little bit about ancient civilizations from an expert in a particular part of the field. And she lives in Merida, and I think I told you about her. She's been on a podcast, Vera Teisler. So she opened up our minds on those civilizations and how they viewed the cosmos. So we spoke a lot about that. We learned much about that as well. From your end, you have been uncovering lots of mysteries and more questions. And you've been doing this, as you mentioned, through your passion or your passions. Let's start off with this. What have you found that others have been slower to come to in terms of ancient civilizations?
My interest is really in the question of the origins of civilization, not only in Mesoamerica, but also beyond that, which is a hypothesis that I develop in my last book, The Empires of Atlantis, where I talk about this idea of a global seafaring culture of prehistoric antiquity. And so since then, I've embarked on a quest for the remnants of this lost civilization all over the world. And as I said, I think the Americas, Central America in particular, is a very fertile ground. You have so much evidence of clearly highly developed, advanced ancient cultures, beginning with the Olmecs, the Mayas, the Aztecs. But we still know very little about how these cultures originated. If you look at the evolution of Maya studies, of Mesoamerican studies for the past century, it's been always pushing back in time the origins of civilization. Right now, the Olmecs are more or less rightfully considered to be the mother culture, the originator culture of Mesoamerica. But I've been asking myself this question: what if the Olmecs were not really that mother culture? What if there were others before the Olmecs, from which the Olmecs themselves inherited lots of their science, civilization, and culture? And so that's where I focused a lot of my research in different parts of Mexico, just trying to understand more about where Mesoamerican civilization originally came from.
Okay, so for the listeners, let's take for the sake of the quick example, the Mayans, the Aztecs, and then the Olmecs. In terms of timelines of what we know, yes, when they lived on this continent, what are we looking at? Just to give some time.
The Aztecs are probably the best known of the ancient Mesoamerican culture. The reason is that they were still a living and thriving civilization at the time of the Spanish conquest in the early 1500s. However, the Aztecs were relatively newcomers in the Valley of Mexico. The Aztecs only arrived in the Valley of Mexico, in the region of Mexico City, in the 14th century AD. So they only had about 200 years of history by the time the Spanish conquest occurred. Long before the Aztecs, there were other cultures. Now, we should look at the center of Mexico as separate from the Maya region, because the cultures that existed there were sort of parallel cultures, but also very different. They share obviously many common traits, but also many differences. So if we look at the center of Mexico, you have the Aztecs, which were settled here at the time of the Spanish conquest. Before the Aztecs, there was the Toltec Empire, which was one of the greatest empires in the history of central Mexico, which lasted from about 900 to 1100 AD. And even before the Toltecs, you have Teotihuacan. Teotihuacan was a sort of the Roman Empire of America. It was this great imperial power settled around central Mexico, the Valley of Mexico, which extended its political, cultural, and possibly also military influence to areas as far as Honduras and Guatemala. Before Teotihuacan, that's where things become a lot muddier, a lot foggier. So you have several different pre-classic cultures, is what archaeologists and historians typically refer to as the pre-classic period of Mesoamerican civilization. So you have.
So this is before. Sorry to interrupt. This is before 1400 BC. This is now pre-classical. Is that what you're saying?
That's before, well, let me say Teotihuacan, the development of Teotihuacan is more or less contemporary with that of the Roman Empire in Europe. So they were sort of contemporaries. We're talking about the first centuries of our era.
Sure.
Before Teotihuacan, you have different cultures, the most important of which were the Olmecs. In terms of the timeline of Olmec civilization, the earliest monumental Olmec sites on the Gulf Coast of Veracruz and Tabasco, they date back from 1200 BC. So we're talking about a time a little over 3,000 years old, and they lasted until about 400 BCE. So there is a sort of gap there. It's not quite, it's not being completely and fully explained between the fall of Olmec civilization and the rise of Teotihuacan, with different hypotheses being made as to what exactly the connection between these two cultures was. But the bottom line is that the Olmecs are generally considered to be these originator culture, the earliest Mesoamerican civilization.
So then why ask, because you mentioned the question that you asked yourself. So I'm going to ask you why you asked yourself, what if the Olmecs weren't the mother culture? Why ask yourself that question?
So for a very long time, people looked at both central Mexico and the Maya region. People didn't know much about the history and the prehistory of Mesoamerica. So based on the texts, based on the colonial accounts, the archaeological evidence, there was this idea of a great Mesoamerican empire that could be identified with the Empire of the Toltecs or with Teotihuacan. But people came to believe, and that was particularly in the early 1900s, that Teotihuacan in central Mexico, the Mayas in Petén and Yucatan, were the original cultures, the original civilizations of Mesoamerica. It was actually quite shocking to Mesoamerican archaeologists when the earliest evidence of Olmec civilization were discovered in Veracruz and Tabasco. That's still a quite recent discovery. Like right now we talk a lot about the Olmecs, but keep in mind that Olmec culture as such was not formally identified until the 1930s, and it was only in the 1960s that a consensus was reached among archaeologists as to the antiquity of the Olmecs. Most people back then, including some very famous, very illustrious archaeologists, refused to acknowledge the primacy of Olmec culture. So the fact that the Olmecs were really the first, they went on to influence Teotihuacan and the Mayas. But still, that left a lot of open, unresolved questions because people were looking at the Olmecs as the originators of things like the calendar, what we call today somehow incorrectly or improperly the Maya calendar. They were the originators of writing in Mesoamerica, of the first forms of monumental architecture, monumental sculpture. Think of the colossal Olmec stone heads, all these giant basalt sculptures. But again, this is pushing back in time the origins of Mesoamerican civilization without quite yet identifying how all these things originated. Let's talk about the calendar, for instance. Now we know that it originated with the Olmecs around 1000 or 1200 BCE. The thing is that even from that very early period, the calendar is already perfect. There is no sign of development, no sign of evolution. Writing is the same. It just appears as if out of nowhere. And for a long time, archaeologists believed that eventually, as more sites were excavated, as excavations were carried out deeper at some of these sites, the evidence for this slow cultural development would eventually emerge. But nothing like that has emerged so far in over 60 years of research. We simply don't know where all of these came from. So it almost comes naturally, this idea that the Olmecs themselves somehow inherited these a lot of their culture, a lot of their civilization from an even earlier civilization.
So let me stop you there because I want to go down that path too. But I don't want to lose the fact that you mentioned, and this is what I read briefly in your research, that their writing system is the oldest in the Americas. Mm-hmm. So 2 questions. 1, their writing system, is it a writing system that we've deciphered? And 2, if we have, what have they told about their own history?
No, we have not yet deciphered the Olmec script. Well, there are different variants to begin with of the Olmec script. It's generally known among archaeologists as the Isthmic or Isthmian script. And it's essentially a set, it's a glyphic system that includes different hieroglyphs, different symbols. But there is still lots of debate as to whether the system is more similar to the Maya. So it's a phonetic system at the end of the day that includes different signs representing syllables or specific nouns, or it is a fully ideographic or logographic system, almost like Chinese. So there is still considerable debate. The reason why there is so much debate is that there are actually very few Olmec inscriptions or Isthmian inscriptions. Pretty much all the documents, all the inscriptions that we have are stone stelas that mostly deal with kingship, they deal with calendar dates. So the scope of these texts is quite limited. It's almost as if you are trying to compile a grammar of the English language based just on the inscriptions on gravestones at the country cemetery. So you're not getting a lot of information really from that. Also, the number of signs is very limited that we know of. And constantly there are new discoveries being made. One of the most fascinating one is a little tablet that was discovered not far from San Lorenzo. It's called the Cascajal block, which is still a very controversial discovery, but that may actually be the earliest writing in the Americas. It's been dated to 1000 BCE, and it's again a variant of the Isthmian script that seems to only have existed for a brief period of time in the region of San Lorenzo, and then disappeared. And I would say also in central Mexico, you have evidence in a site called Tlatilco of the use of a different type of writing. There is a beautiful seal that was discovered at Tlatilco in the early 1900s that contains a type of writing system that is different from the Olmec, and that's so far the only example of that script that's been found. And it also dates from more or less the same period as the Cascajal block, so talking about 1000 BC.
Okay, so let's go back to the path that I said we shouldn't forget about. Preface that with something else I heard you say in another interview. And that interview was prompting you or was asking you about, in general, I think. That's all I remember because I just took these notes and it was a couple of months ago. The Egyptian, a particular Egyptian site in Gobekli Tepe in Turkey. And you said it doesn't show development, but rather a legacy of technology and knowledge from elsewhere. Go. What does that mean?
That's the case with Gobekli Tepe. It's this now very famous site in southeastern Turkey, which is considered to be the earliest monumental construction, or the oldest temple, really, anywhere in the world. You have these very sophisticated megalithic enclosures built with hundreds of T-shaped stone pillars, some of which weighed over 50 tons. So we're really talking about monumental architecture at a point in time over 11,000 years ago, when nobody believed that such a complex, sophisticated civilization could exist. Now, the point with Gobekli Tepe is obviously it has pushed back our entire idea of the origin, development of civilization by several thousand years. But even so, Gobekli Tepe shows a remarkable sophistication. Where did these people learn how to carve, how to move huge stone blocks? Where did they learn about astronomy, sophisticated mathematics that is all incorporated in the layout, in the architecture of the site? There is even a suggestion that some of the symbols that are found on the pillars, on these huge T-shaped pillars, may be a sort of very early stage embryonic writing system, which is quite astonishing. But obviously, all of these must have come from somewhere. Again, archaeologists try to explain it with this idea of slow, gradual development over centuries and thousands of years. We just have not yet found where this development occurred. We see these sites like Gobekli Tepe, like the Olmecs in Mesoamerica, that appear as if out of nowhere, without the corresponding cultural evolution they would expect before them.
Well, they seem to appear out of nowhere just because we haven't been able to discover anything before that. I mean, it's just perception because of our limited knowledge, right?
Yes. And I think that's very much the case with Gobekli Tepe, and constantly there are new sites being explored, being excavated. In the case of the Olmecs, there was also the expectation eventually people would find evidence of this slow development and evolution. The point is that in over 60 years of research, nothing has been found, at least in the what is called as the Olmec Center, which is the region of southern Veracruz and Tabasco, where we see the earliest monumental development of Olmec civilization.
What do you say to people who say to you, if you've had this said to you, but who would say in general, like, who cares if you found something that's older than what we thought? Like, who cares if it's 3,000, 4,000, 11,000, 50,000, 300,000? Who cares? Doesn't affect my life.
I think, probably not on a daily basis, I would say. But I think it's a very interesting question if you think about the future of civilization as well. So we tend to think about our civilization as essentially something eternal. Like we don't tend to think about the possibility that our civilization may collapse at some point. However, if we look back in time, we realize very soon that history is essentially a cemetery of empires and civilizations. So why would our civilization be any different? What makes us special? I'm sure if you asked a Roman citizen at the peak of the empire, they would have thought the Roman Empire to be eternal, to be still around for thousands and thousands of years. And I'm sure if you also ask some of the inhabitants of these great Maya cities that ended up having a population in the hundreds of thousands, if they would have envisioned the end of the civilization, they would have considered you completely crazy. And yet these civilizations are now abandoned and covered by the jungle in Central America. So I think there is probably a lesson there to be learned about the fact that civilizations rise and fall constantly throughout history, and there's really nothing special about our own civilization. I think there is a lot we can learn from the mistakes of past civilizations as to why they collapsed and or why they were successful in a way.
Yeah. But let's be honest, though, you want to know more than that. You want to know the origins of civilization.
Yes.
Why?
Yes, I think that's a very fundamental question. I think it's a very one of the fundamental questions that humanity has been asking for thousands of years. Where do we come from, essentially? Where does our civilization, our culture come from? That's where I think the two very different worldviews collide. This is something that I also discuss extensively about in my book, The Empires of Atlantis. I think our modern view of civilization is one of linear development. So we have this idea that we constantly evolve from more primitive, less sophisticated forms to more complex, more sophisticated types
That's the most
of
convenient
civilization.
explanation. Yes.
Right, but it's also fundamentally wrong. And we don't have to go much farther back than the Middle Ages, for instance, to see what happened after the fall of the Roman Empire. And there are plenty of examples all over the world of why civilizations fail, why civilizations collapse. So that history is by no means a linear evolutionary process. Now, this contrasts with the ancient worldview that for thousands of years was the worldview of great civilizations such as the ancient Egyptians, the Greek, the Mayans, that instead of a linear evolution, we should look at history as cyclical. There are cycles of civilization. And in fact, we are, according to many worldviews, not at the peak of the cycle right now, but quite at the opposite end. We're quite at the bottom of the cycle right now. And civilization is essentially still recovering from some major cataclysm that occurred thousands, maybe tens of thousands of years ago.
So you said earlier, and you were referring, I suspect, to the book that you put together a while ago, that you published a while ago, and you dropped a hint of what you've been researching or supposing, an ancient seafaring peoples that seeded other civilizations.
Yes.
So number one, what do you mean? And then number two, why do you believe this or think this or know this?
I think if you look at all the commonalities between ancient cultures, you very soon start realizing that this idea of independent evolution is quite untenable. It's very clear that these civilizations not only mutually influenced each other, even across continents and oceans, but when you go at a really fundamental level, looking into the myths, the beliefs of these cultures, you soon start realizing that this must have come from some common ancestor. It's not only a matter of this civilization having been in contact with each other, but of them having inherited a lot of their culture and civilization from somebody else. And that's exactly what many of these ancient people tell us in their myths. They do not look at their ancestors as primitives or savages, quite the other way around. They talk about these legendary times, or this time of the gods or demigods, when this idea of the golden age that you find, for instance, in the Hindu Yuga cycles in ancient Greece, and that civilization went through multiple cycles of rise and fall over time. So even this idea, which I think to some extent is a philosophical tale, but also probably rooted in history, that Plato conveys of Atlantis as the origin of civilization, this idea there was an ancestor civilization that seeded all later cultures around the world, and that humanity essentially fell from a semi-divine or almost godly state down to essentially what is our today's mortal condition.
You know, this kind of conversation never really interested me when I was younger. It does interest me now, not because I want to know whether it's true or not. I want to get to know the people who spend the time thinking about it. So we've had many a person now on the podcast I shouldn't say many, but a lot, in my opinion, more than I had ever met outside the podcast, of people who study and know indigenous lore around the world. So we're talking about Mesoamerica, Australia, West Africa, India, Southern Europe, for that Northern Europe. And yes, we've been finding just specifically on the conversation on this podcast that all these lores, these myths, all have very thick common threads of a superior or divine people bringing tools, bringing knowledge, bringing wisdom. I mean, it's not far-fetched to see that these common ties there could be a reason, a logical reason for this. And I tie that to how we come to our modern knowledge. So I grew up in a school system where we believed there were 9 planets. So that was changed after I finished my school, my formal schooling in science in the mid-90s. And now we know that there are thousands of planets. But before 1994, 95, nobody, quote unquote, knew this. So I think, again, not to belabor the point here, so maybe there's a question embedded. I think we suffer from the arrogance of believing that our point in time of living is the pinnacle of the knowledge that we could possibly have. And I think people shut down from that. They shut off. They shut off the pipe because this is what I've learned. This is what I know. There can't be more than this. Look at where we live. Look what's around us. Look at what we've achieved in our civilization. It can't be anything more. Like that kind of mentality. And I think that's dispersed. That's not a mentality of experts. That's just a mentality of human beings in general. I think we inherit that mentality. Oh, yes. So anyway, I don't know if that's a question, but so
yes.
let me go back then to my question. Why do you think that this was a seafaring people?
Well, they must have been in order to see all these different cultures around the world. That's pretty much the only explanation for all these commonalities you find, for instance, between the New World, Old World culture, the diffusion across the world of certain symbols and myths. And not talking just about superficial similarities. I'm talking about like very deep rooted commonalities, like the same set of myths, beliefs, religious traditions, symbols that you find all around the world. There is also pretty significant evidence of the fact that these people that we may refer to as megalithic builder, I like to refer to them as such, because most of the monuments associated with this civilization or culture are really megalithic structures. They had already embarked on long-distance sea voyages thousands of years before Christ. Now, even without going into the more controversial topic of whether like a truly global seafaring civilization existed, it's been very well proven, for instance, that in the European Neolithic period, we're talking about 3000 BC or around 5,000 years old, the megalithic builders from Ireland, the British Islands, they colonized, they settled the coasts of Portugal, Spain, eventually even reaching into the Mediterranean. You can tell that based on the dates of the different sites. You can almost like follow their path along the coast, along the sea, and the similarity in the monuments, in the style of the position, in the ceramic is obvious. Now you're talking about something that occurred more or less 4,000 or 5,000 years ago that we understand from an archaeological point of view. Obviously, it's much more controversial to assume that the same happened between the old and the new world.
What is ARCS?
So the ARCS project is a research association that I, together with a few associates, launched in 2021 with the objective of researching the question of Mesoamerican origins. As a researcher based in Mexico, I saw this opportunity of contributing to our understanding of the Mesoamerican past and uncovering uncovering more sites, more artifacts that can help understand better how Mesoamerican civilization originated. If you look at Mexico, Central America, there are literally thousands, if not tens of thousands, of archaeological sites that have not yet been explored or investigated. And many of these sites, we have reason to believe, may hold very important clues about the origins of Mesoamerican civilization. And so there was a need for an initiative, which is, in fact, a non-profit. The ARCS project has been incorporated as a non-profit foundation, but obviously we work together and very closely with government institutions, with academic institutions, in order to promote these kind of research. And we do that by providing funding, providing logistical support for different kinds of research and expeditions.
Well, let's take one example here, because recently, I think recently, you have been working on a Project Mitlan.
Mm-hmm. That's correct.
Do you want to talk about that a little bit and what you found on the ground?
Yes. So project, it's called Project Mitla or Project Lioba. Lioba was the ancient Zapotec name of the site, which literally means underworld. Lioba, exactly. Was a project kicked off in 2022. We've had so far 2 research seasons, 2 field seasons in Mitla in 2022 and 2023. And the objective of the project was to use geophysical methods to see below the ground, underneath the ground of Mitla, in order to identify possible subterranean chambers and tunnels underneath the site. Why we know that these chambers and tunnels are there is because there are several accounts from the colonial period about the fact that a large subterranean labyrinth existed under the site of Mitla, whose entrances were then sealed off by Spanish priests in the early 1500s. However, archaeologists have so far been unable to confirm the existence of these subterranean labyrinth, because that lies underneath the entire site, the entire town of Mitla. That's the reason why we used these non-invasive geophysical methods to quite literally see below the ground without the need of excavations.
Wow. Okay, so you've seen, or you've confirmed the existence of this labyrinth underground.
Yes, and not only that, we actually identified several subterranean chambers, several tunnels. It's what we believe part of a much more extensive tunnel system underneath the site that may connect with one or more natural caverns.
And have you been able to date them?
No, not until we actually reach these chambers. Right now, everything we have done is to identify and point to their size, location, orientation with fairly good degree of accuracy. The next step is to conduct archaeological excavations or drilling into specific parts of the site to actually not only confirm the existence and the nature of these chambers, but also to identify any artifacts of archaeological significance that they may contain that can help to date the site.
And much of this, or part of this, or all of this is underneath property of the Catholic Church? Or am I
part of it is underneath the Church of Mitla. In fact, the Church of Mitla, Church of San Pablo Apostol, was built directly on top of what we believe was the most important Zapotec temple of the site. And so that's the reason why there is an entrance that we have identified and imaged with geophysical methods right underneath the main altar of the Catholic Church.
Isn't that's just so fascinating, right? I mean, that's not something that we grew up asking, because again, right? Like if we don't know, then we don't ask the questions. and we're trained in what we ought to know. So we're trained, religiously speaking. I grew up Catholic. I mean, so we're trained to know about what the Catholic Church is, but we don't really know until we ask questions. That Catholic Church, and this is not just the Catholic Church. We're not slighting the Catholic Church here, but religions, belief systems that have physical structures usually build these physical structures to impose, right? To impose upon older ones, to erase older ones, or to compete with older belief systems. And over time, you forget that those belief systems even existed. And physically speaking, many of them, the remnants of those, or reminders of those, exist physically underneath others. And we don't know. Like we walk around every day. Like, as you said, in our everyday, we can't be bothered by this. So, we go home, we go to work, we go to the grocery store, we take our kids to practice. But all the while, generation after generation, we have no idea that other radically different belief systems existed as part of our own ancient cultures that could maybe, if we awaken to, I'm saying my what if, I guess. If I have always lived under this belief system that I belong to this set of cultural values, but only because I didn't know that there was another set of cultural values right underneath me, right? Figuratively speaking, underneath my nose, then I can't live a fuller life. Like I will die not even knowing that it's there. So I guess maybe that's why I was curious in speaking to you, and why we're curious about speaking to people who ask those what ifs, because I'm like, maybe people like you can help me ask just one more question I wouldn't have asked before I die. maybe that's why we reached out to you. I don't know. That's not a question, but I find it fascinating that you're doing this not as a professional archaeologist. You're doing this because you're following your own line of curiosities, and you're not profiting from this as a career, right? That you're, I mean, I'm making these assumptions.
Quite the contrary. I've been actually investing and throwing quite a bit of money at these research.
Well, money that can go to your kids.
Absolutely. But that's why I say this is totally a passion of mine. You need to be passionate about these things to really spend so much time and resources. But at the same time, I think it's important because that tries to answer a very fundamental question about where do we come from and the origins of civilization. In a way, it's also a form of reparation towards the ancient and native people here of the Americas, of Mexico, just bringing back to light some of their cultural heritage that's been quite literally buried for centuries and forgotten,
Sure.
or that the Catholic Church and other institutions have in different ways tried to erase for centuries.
Yeah, well, in the same way that other ancient civilizations would have done the same to prior civilizations. So I get that. Like, how far back? I mean, the question is, this is just like, how far back or do we have to go in order to figure out what reparations to pay? Whereas I think, how far back should we go until we're satisfied with the question of our origin? Like, that's more interesting, right? Because there's a commonality there. Where is our origin?
Well, that's a very difficult question to answer. Like, a possible explanation I give in my book, again, going back to this concept, to this idea of a global seafaring culture, prehistoric antiquities, that was the origin of all world civilizations and cultures. So there may have been a civilization that existed thousands, perhaps even tens of thousands of years ago, and that perished in a cataclysm at the end of the last ice age. So we're all essentially still recovering from that amnesia. I really like this definition by Graham Hancock
Yeah, sure.
about the human condition. We're a species with amnesia because we have forgotten so much about our past. And there is probably one very important, maybe more important episodes in the very ancient history of mankind that have been almost completely forgotten. If you think about that, and this is just by accepted mainstream science, anatomically modern humans have been around for over 100,000 years. Now, is it reasonable to think that out of those 100,000 years, we've only discovered civilization in the last 5,000 of those? There is a lot of space, there is a lot of room for many different cycles of civilization in these 100,000 years.
Yeah, well, we had Michael Cremo on the show, and I mean, you know Michael Cremo, so he wrote that seminal book in the 90s. Yeah, okay, so yeah, that's right, because you and I chatted about it too. I remember this now. But he goes in depth about discovering what his aha moment is, discovering that archaeologists in the latter half of the 1800s were actually postulating that human civilization had been existing for millions of years until a small group of archaeologists decided, no, this is the science that we're going to teach the world, and they decided on a time frame.
Yeah. That was the belief of many ancient culture, which is something I find fascinating. The way that modern science, Western science in particular, just looks down at these native indigenous traditions. So if you look at, for instance, at the ancient traditions of the Sumerians, the Egyptians, the Mesoamerican people, they all talk about essentially the same thing, that their civilization is not hundreds, not even thousands, but tens of thousands of years old. There are records from Mesopotamia, from Sumer in the form of king's lists and annals that stretch back tens of thousands of years. Now, archaeologists just dismiss them as mythical records, as fairy tales, essentially. But to the people who compiled these records, these were not fairy tales. These were at least the way they viewed the origin of their culture. Think about Egypt, for instance. There is a very clear distinction in Egyptian history from the point of view of the Egyptians themselves between the age of the gods, the age of the demigods, and the age of the mortal kings. So when we talk about the mortal kings, that pretty much agrees with the modern Egyptological view, the different dynasties that succeeded each other from about 3000 BCE. However, the ancient Egyptians say that that was not the origin of their civilization, because before these first dynasties, there were others that lasted thousands of years. The Turin Papyrus mentions royal dynasties that ruled 36,000 years before the first historical dynasty that we know of. And there are very clear hints in these documents that these dynasties were not indigenous to Egypt. They came to Egypt from somewhere else. So again, that goes back to this idea that many of these ancient cultures were somehow seeded from somewhere else.
What do you think we are?
That's a very broad question. I think the picture of human origins, and not only talking about archaeology or the study of the history of civilization, but just from an anthropological point of view, has significantly evolved over the past few decades, the past few years, really. Right now, we know, for instance, that we're not the result of just a linear process of evolution from some more or less mythical ancestor like Homo erectus or Australopithecus and so on. But in fact, pretty much every modern human living today is the result of the genetic admixture of several different human species. So each one of us has at least a little bit of Neanderthal DNA, possibly Denisovan DNA. So there is now this whole mosaic of a very different human species that somehow contributed to what we call anatomically modern humans today. But I think we've moved away, particularly in recent years, from this idea, again, of a linear anthropological evolution, which you went from, let's say, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, then Neanderthals, then Cro-Magnon or anatomically modern humans, to a view in which different human species interacted and interbred with each other to produce what we call today anatomically modern humans. So I think the picture of human origins all of a sudden has become much more complex. And also the question of what makes us human at the end of the day.
So in your work, in your archaeological exploration around the world, not just in Mesoamerica, because you've been, we haven't even talked about this at all, but you've been anywhere and everywhere around the world.
Into many places, yes.
Right. We were talking about this, so I didn't mention that, but just for the listener, you've been everywhere in the Middle East, you've been in India, or you are going to India again with your dad?
At the end of this year, yes.
That's right, you told me. You've been to South America, North Africa, and Asia. What, in all the exploration that you've done, discovery that you've done, and everything else around satisfying those curiosities, has this informed you, ancient people's beliefs? Have they informed your current beliefs at all?
I think just beyond, of course, like what the archaeologists do is looking at artifacts. So you're essentially looking at a collection of dead things to try to understand and get a sense about what people were thinking about, how they lived, and so on. But of course, that's a very incomplete picture that we have of the past. We can gather a lot more from texts, but again, these go back only so many centuries, so many thousands of years. So something that's fascinating to me, and that's a big part of my research, is figuring out what can we deduce about the philosophy, the thinking, the culture of these ancient people, just based on the artifacts, on the objects that they left behind. And something that has always struck me is the way, for instance, they looked at the sky. Like astronomy, you find pretty much all over the world these idea that we find pretty much across all the ancient global cultures around the world, that life on Earth is somehow influenced by the stars or by different types of cosmic influences. It's very obvious to me that the reason why these people were looking at the sky was not just to know when to plant or when to
have babies.
Yeah, exactly. It's like very, very practical things. There were like very deep religious beliefs underneath that. And so uncovering that, I think it's important. Going back to Gobekli Tepe, for instance, in Turkey, this is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, monumental architecture ever produced by humans. And you already find evidence that these people were looking at the sky, that these people, in a way, must have had a set of beliefs related to the stars, the sky. So that's something you find from the very, very beginning of human civilization. It's just fascinating to me. The fact that all these ancient cultures had so much interest in the heavens, in the sky, and in a way projected their myths into the heavens.
If you were given I hate asking this question, that's why I don't ask it, but I feel like I need to with you. If you're given a wand and told, you wave this and you will get one free wish to know whatever it is that you want to know, go.
Well, probably take a time machine and go back some 10,000 years and look at what was there. I think that's probably every archaeologist's dream, to see these ancient cultures that we study, that we research just based on the artifacts that are left behind in the full of their flourishings. And maybe that picture is going to look completely different from the ideas that we have developed. But yes, if I had this magic wand, I would probably travel back in time.
So you said 10,000 years. Would it be 10,000 years?
Probably a little bit more. Probably a little bit more. So right now, many there is this idea that some major cataclysm occurred at the end of the last ice age. So we're talking about time period that scientists refer to as the Younger Dryas. That's around 10,500 years BC by most estimates. So what existed before that? I think that's the question that we're trying to answer, what we're trying to understand.
What advice do you give to your kids, or would you give to your kids about choosing their future?
I think it's always a be curious, challenge dogma, mainstream beliefs. If you think about the history of science, the history of cultural revolutions, every new discovery can entirely reshape the paradigm. But if you're not curious, if you're not looking for the answers or just asking the right questions, there is just no innovation. There is really no way you can evolve the paradigm. You're just stuck.
So I'm with you 100% as a parent. It's so obvious as a parent who's maybe awakened, who has awakened to their own world, to give that to their kids. 100%. That's the advice I try to give my kids too. Not too much, because then they stop listening, which is something they're really good at doing. Let me put it this way. I don't want to be bored by people, because I'm generally interested in people, really generally interested. I want to know people's stories. I find, and you tell me your thoughts here. I find that staying true to curious question making is the start.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a process. It's not the end. It's a start. And it can be a kickstart to everything, but everything. And if enough of us are curious, for the sake of being curious, I mean, this world would not look like the way it looks like now. Your thoughts? It just came to me here as I'm listening to
me. To me, it's really important. Something I would always challenge my kids is to develop, I would say definitely curiosity, but I think even more importantly, critical thinking. I think this is particularly important now in this sort of post-truth world in which we live with deep fakes and artificial intelligence and so on. And certainly it's going to be even more so by the time our kids are adults. So how can discern, how can they differentiate between between what they should believe in, essentially, what is truth, and how they build their own reality at the end of the day. And I think, yes, it's a mix of curiosity, it's a mix of critical thinking. And again, to your point, I think it's not curiosity for its own sake. It's also about asking the right questions. So educating our children to ask the right questions that are meaningful and can really help, if answered, to make the world a better place or make a difference in the world.
Yeah. Again, I'm with you, brother. Okay, last question. What's greatness to you?
So to me, greatness is goes back to this point I just made of making a difference in the world. I think we all want to leave a mark of some kind, meaningfully improving the world from how we found it. And so to me, greatness has to do with just advancing that, not just for ourselves, but for all the people around us. And thinking just more broadly about how do you make that kind of impact on society. I think that's where like true greatness lies.
Wonderfully put. My only last comment to this, before we come to an end here, is I really do, whether I agree with people or not, I really do respect people who take large chunks of their time of their lives to pursue the curiosities apart from looking for financial success from it. Because that's where the interesting stuff really happens. And we know this. That's evidenced in all the innovation that we know. And I shouldn't say all, but again, broad strokes. That's an example. That's an example for people. And I'm glad we reached out like this. I mean, you don't need me to say it, but keep doing what you're doing.
If I can add just one closing thought, and you asked the question a number of times about why and how does a person with more like traditional business background get into this kind of research into archaeology, like spend so much of their like time and money into this kind of research. I think to me, at the end of the day, it's really about pursuing one's passions. I think that business people as well have a lot to contribute in terms of the work ethics, in terms of like tools, processes, just like the very basics, just like the very fundamentals of how you manage, how you operate a business, that can significantly and meaningfully improve areas that are not business related. Obviously, even if you think about a field like archaeology, there is a desperate need for funding, for resources. However, the people who manage this type of projects, they do not have a business mindset. It's not about making money. It's really about just like managing scarcity. It's about managing resources in the most efficient, in the most effective way possible. And this is what business people are good at the end of the day. So I think there is a lot that people like myself, like yourself, who are like in different paths of life in business can contribute a lot to research, to the advance of knowledge in a meaningful way outside of just our more or less narrow fields of interest.
I'm going to make sure to have my kids listen to this one. Marco. Thank you, Marco. Thank you for, again, thank you for doing what you do and your real input in my questions. I also appreciate the fact that you're not philosophizing about things. You're putting a practical eye on the discovery. That's, again, to strengthen the point that you just made. Thank you again for coming on. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Chano. It's been a pleasure.